It's remote, it's empty, and it's sitting high up on the top of a mountain in the Flint Creek Range of the Rockies. Granite is the home of unique ruins, a sprawling mill site, and what were once two of the longest aerial trams in the United States. Come along as we explore the ruins of this old mining town that was once one of the biggest cities in Montana, and at its height was the largest producer of silver in the world, earning this town the nickname the Silver Queen. This is the story of Granite, Montana. Before Granite was founded at the top of the mountain, down at the foot of that same mountain was the already thriving small mining town of Philipsburg. Philipsburg was founded in 1866, starting as a mining town and trading post, growing rapidly to more than 1,500 people by the end of 1867. The population of the town crashed to only 3 people around 1869, but come 1871 the population was slowly rising again. It was then, in 1871, that Philipsburg residents Eli Holland and James Hill were out hunting in the hills above the town. They shot a buck deer, and as it struggled, it kicked up rocks and dirt. Some of these rocks had noticeable signs of silver in them. They brought them back to Philipsburg to be assayed and found that the ore was very rich. Holland then dug a shaft around the claim and collected additional samples, slowly working the site with his friends until about 1875 when the mining claim lapsed, and he lost control of the site and abandoned it. Around this time, a man named Charles McClure was exploring that area. McClure was the superintendent of the Hope Mill down the mountain in Philipsburg, and he saw potential in the hilltop mine site beyond what Holland had done with it. He found in Holland's dump site a piece of discarded ore and had that assessed. It rang in at an astonishing 2,000 ounces of silver per ton, making it one of the richest strikes in the area. He entered into a business partnership with a man named Charles Clark, bought up the rights to the mining claim, and established the Granite Mountain Mining Company. They sought outside investment and raised $10 million from investors around St. Louis, or over $250 million today. This is obviously no small amount of money, but it was a matter of being in the right place at the right time, and being the right people. Charles McClure was already successful with his work in Philipsburg, and many of the Philipsburg team had already struck it rich with Nevada's Comstock lode. Silver was a hot commodity in the 1870s, with investors back east itching to get a stake in Western silver production. Between 1880 and 1882, the mining company poured money into the development of the site and was sinking mine shafts. From the start, one of the biggest challenges that the mining company faced was the difficult climb up the mountain from nearby Philipsburg, which they were using as a base camp. A road was built, but all that equipment needed to be hauled up by large horse teams. Crew that weren't camping on the site had to walk up and down the mountain each day for work. Depending on which route they took, it could be anywhere from 3 to 5 miles, up a steep mountain through rugged terrain. It was terribly exhausting and led to the story that I'm about to tell you, one of the most painful mining stories you've ever heard. It's the story of a man named McIntyre, who ran a dig team that was hired to sink a shaft 50 feet deep at the top of Granite Mountain. In exchange, McIntyre would receive a full quarter interest in the mine. He hauled his team and equipment up that mountain, already worn out by the time they got up there, and they dug the shaft. It's unclear how long the digging took, but once the job was completed, McIntyre packed everything up and had his team haul it all the way back down the mountain to Philipsburg. They were absolutely beat and sick of that mountain. When the mining company looked over the shaft, it was found to be a foot short of the 50 feet required, coming in at only 49 feet. Instead of bringing his team back up the mountain to finish the job, he simply abandoned his claim on that quarter interest. In those 49 feet, they didn't find any silver. The mine was looking like a complete bust, And maybe, after all, the ore that McClure had found was a fluke. Well, 2 years elapsed, McIntyre was out of the picture, and no silver was found, even though additional mine chutes had been dug by other teams. Of the $10 million invested, over $132,000 was already spent without a single find. The investors in St. Louis sent McClure a telegram telling him to shut the mine down and give up. But on its last day of operations during the last shift, in fact, on the last bit of explosives used to chip away at the rock, they found silver. The cancellation was canceled, and mining continued. Instead of hauling everyone and everything back up the mountain and digging one more foot, McIntyre missed out on shares that would have yielded him $3 million in dividends alone, or, get ready, $84 million in today's money. No word on how McIntyre was doing when he found that out. Someone really should check in on him. Another similar story goes that a horse trader named Big Slim had stock in the mine, and in the days before silver was found was so fed up with the operation. While drinking in a bar in Philipsburg, he called out that if he had the money to buy a horse, he would pack up and leave this town. The bartender offered to trade his own horse for Big Slim's stock in the mine, and Big Slim agreed, and off he went with the horse. A few weeks later, after the silver was struck, the bartender sold that stock for $14,000, or over $400,000 today. The 49-foot mine shaft that McIntyre dug was continued by the mining company and became known as the Ruby Shaft, as the silver that they were mining was pyrargyrite, also known as ruby silver, for the deep red hues in the ore. By 1884, a town was developing at the top of the mountain around the granite mine for the mine workers and their families. Miners would have to build their own houses, or pay to have them built, and lease the land from the company for $2.50 a month. Up until this point, however, the mine was still shipping its ore down the mountain to the Algonquin mine in Philipsburg, so in 1885, a mill was built right on site in Granite, just downhill from the mine. This was a 20-stamp mill, meaning there were 20 stamps inside the mill used to crush the raw ore the mine produced in order to extract the silver inside. 20 stamps was considered a fairly large mill for the time, but Granite was producing so much silver ore that an additional mill, with 80 more stamps, was built nearby, giving the Granite mine a total of 100 stamps. This was a massive operation, producing over $1 million in revenue a year, that earned the mine the nickname of the Silver Queen. In fact, the money from the Granite mine made its way back to its St. Louis backers and was used to build the Eads Bridge in St. Louis. While much of the wooden structure of the mills here at Granite are collapsed or gone completely, we can see their foundations and many, many outbuildings in decent shape. The start of the mining process began right around here. This was the location of the Ruby Shaft, the first 49 feet of which were dug by McIntyre, and now it's completely fenced off for safety reasons. The shaft that McIntyre initially dug was continued, but a second shaft was started at the same spot that went down for over 1,500 feet, yielding massive amounts of both silver and gold. Being a vertical shaft, a hoist was needed to lower workers down into the mine inside of an elevator cage. The massive wooden hoist house was built around both branches of the Ruby Shaft to house the machinery needed for the hoist, as well as to provide a staging area for the mining operations below ground. You could see how thick the timber had to be in order to lift the ore out of the mine shaft. What's left of the hoist house and the Ruby Shaft is little more than a pile of timbers strewn around a massive pit in the hillside. From the hoist house, mine carts on a small railroad track would carry the ore 300 feet to the north, along this wooden trestle to the mill. You can actually see where the track would have been. This track was once enclosed in a long wooden shack, which doubled as storage for coal, salt, paint, and lime. while oil was kept in the brick building across the street.
That's hanging pretty precariously up there. This is definitely going to collapse in the next couple years. Look, this isn't even in the ground. It's just barely affixed to this concrete base.
While the wooden storage and rail shack is deteriorating fast, it still retains some of its shape, and the tracks that it once housed are still distinct. From the end of the track here, the ore would be dropped down into the mill. A quick look at the plan of the mill reveals that the original 20-stamp mill and the subsequent 80-stamp mill ultimately were housed within the same facility, giving us this massive ruin of stone and wood on the northern end of the mining site.
This would have been the stamp mill. Remnants of the mining rails.
This part belonged to the wing of the mill that housed the original 20 stamps. These oven-looking brick arches correspond with the location of the mill's roasters, although these may just be the arches to support its weight. At the north end of the mill sites at the top of Elk Street are a couple of buildings: the Busket General Store and the Granite Mountain Mining Company office.
Behind me in this depression was the Busket Mercantile General Store, which was actually owned by the Granite Mountain Mining Company. Now, this was a company town. Most people in this town lived off of the company's money. They were earning revenue from working in the mine, and then they came to the town and they spent all of that money in stores and saloons and inns owned by the mining company. And that way, all of the money that they're giving the workers stays more or less close to the company. Unfortunately, that meant it was very difficult to save up your money if you wanted to move out and stop working for the company.
All that remains of the Granite Mountain Mining office next door is the old brick vault that was inside of it.
Now, that vault would have been where the company kept everyone's payroll every month, which means that vault was also the target for a good number of robbers.
Now, the whole Philipsburg and Granite mining district became convoluted as business operations went on, with other mining companies being established and bought out and new mills being built at each site. Near Granite Mountain was the James Blaine claim, which McClure bought in 1883 and tried to sell to his own company. The Board of Advisors rejected it, although 80% of the board members ended up individually investing in it, so it was virtually owned by the Granite Mountain Mining Company, but not really, just the same people who owned it. This other company was known as the Bimetallic Mining Company and built a 50-stamp mill near Philipsburg in 1888. Then there was the third-party Rumsey mine to the south, along the Fred Burr Creek, which was established and then bought out by the Granite Mountain Mining Company, which built a 100-stamp mill at the site in 1889. Even with the 100 stamps up on the mountaintop at the granite mills, ore production at the granite mine outpaced what they could process. Therefore, the granite mine was relying heavily on the nearby mills down the mountain at other town sites as well, including the ones that I just mentioned. To haul the thousands of tons of ore down the mountain to these mills, an aerial tramway was built. At 9,750 feet long, this was the longest aerial tramway in the United States at the time, with a vertical drop of 1,225 feet. It ran all the way down from the granite mines at the top of the mountain to the bimetallic mill near Philipsburg. They also built an additional tramway from the Ruby Shaft to the Rumsey Mill, that was nearly as long. Each tram bucket could carry 500 pounds of ore down the mountain and return up the mountain with fuel, supplies, or, if the company wasn't paying attention, people hiding in them to save them the walk up the mountain. You can actually see some of the collapsed supports for the tramway as it left here and descended down the mountain. Another support would have been there, and there probably would have been even more, about evenly spaced, all the way down the mountainside. The towers for the tram were wooden, holding up a steel cable suspended by rollers. We have the guide wheels up there. This one's been broken off really badly. The caption on this image explains that the horses are hauling a 22,500 pound cable up the mountain, which may have been used in the construction of the tram. One thing that I'm seeing a lot of is a ton of this original cable still strewn around the ruin. These massive links. It was built by the Trenton Iron Works Company in New Jersey and shipped all the way across the country to here. It had a daily carrying capacity of 200 tons. The largest remaining wooden structure at the mill site is this partially collapsed tower. It's here that the aerial tram from the Ruby Mine begins its long descent down the mountain to the Rumsey Mill. Between the wind, the rain, and the shifting of the earth, these wooden structures start to twist and warp until they finally collapse after about a century. Oh, it's nice and cool down here. I've actually gone in quite a bit farther than I intended to. I don't feel good being down here. Building is creaking. I can even see some of it shifting. And, oh, look, lovely, it's dripping on me. It's the snow melt coming down. Because of the dramatically steep slope this tramway head is built on, it's reinforced by a massive retaining wall of logs. All right, time to get out of here. Immediately next to the tramway head house is a large retaining wall that juts out from the hillside, towering alongside of it. It's unclear what this wall was for, but it may have been the southernmost portion of the retaining wall built around the Ruby Shaft hoisting house. And if it is, then the rest of the wall has long since collapsed, with the dirt it was holding up burying most of the log debris. Huh. Maybe I shouldn't have climbed up on that thing. Look how much that's leaning. At the foot of both the retaining wall and the tramway house is this little shack. It's not listed on any maps of the town, but could simply have been for storage, or used as a small workshop. It seemed to have some sort of plumbing. This was once lined with that corrugated metal you see in that corner. It helped keep the draft out. It's in great shape compared to the rest of this place. In 1890, it's said that the Granite Mountain District produced over $4 million in gold and silver, or over $110 million in today's money. The town prospered and outshined any other town in the area. Now, Granite was one of the largest towns in the county, with over 3,000 people living on this rocky mountaintop. Water was hauled up a flume and stored in large water tanks, and most supplies were brought up by the aerial tramway. Of those 3,000 residents, only about half of them worked in connection with the mining and milling operation. The others were families of the workers, or worked in the many civil or hospitality buildings throughout the town. A quick look at the town in 1892 shows dozens and dozens of saloons and restaurants along the town's main street, home to this beautiful ruin. In 1890, the miners of granite unionized, and with their union, they built the most iconic building in town, the Miners' Union Hall. The grand opening of this hall was New Year's Eve, 1890, and the hall quickly became the social center of the whole town. This massive building was made of granite and brick, with a wrought iron facade that is now exposed. We can still see the maker's stamp reading Western Iron Works, Butte, Montana. The interior walls and ceilings were plastered with pine wood trim finely molded and painted on the inside of the building. The first floor was a recreation hall for miners with billiard tables. The second floor was the home of the dance hall, which could accommodate 500 seats for theatrical performances or concerts, with a stage in the back. If you moved those chairs out of the way, it would reveal a dance floor underneath. The dance floor was made of solid maple and said to be the finest in the Northwest. On the third floor was a meeting room for clubs and secret societies. Today, the hall is one of the last major structures still standing in granite. In 1966, vandals set fire to the ruins, and now all that's left are these outer walls. These old black and white photos that we've been looking at were taken a year before the hall was destroyed, capturing how it looked in its very final days. It's said that the hall still had its billiard tables in it up until the 1950s. The Miners' Union, like their hall, was also the center of attention for most of the town's history. Miners' Union Day was every June 13th and celebrated with a big festival in town, full of games, contests, and concluded with a dance at the Miners' Hall. One Miners' Union Day featured a tug-of-war between a team from the Granite Mountain Mine and another from the Bimetallic Mine, with the Bimetallic miners winning and taking home a wager of over $500 or $17,000 today. The Miners' Union Parade was a way for the town's miners to show off and feel like they're a part of the team, marching right down Main Street. As they paraded, they would have passed well over 100 businesses, shops, and apartments along the main strip. Directly across from the Miners' Union Hall was a print shop, which printed the town's newspaper, the Granite Mountain Star. This print shop might also have belonged to a German photographer and printer named Charles Weitfle. If this one didn't belong to him, then another one the next street over did. Weitfle printed postcards, stereo views, and even this wonderful little book in 1893 titled Views of Granite, Philipsburg, and Vicinity. The pictures inside are intricately detailed and based on photographs that he took showing sights around the two towns, the mills, and even the mining teams. One picture of interest is this one, showing a massive piece of ore that the Bimetallic Mine sent to the Columbian Exposition in Chicago. This piece weighed more than 2 tons and was assessed for 973 ounces of silver per ton. Nearly every building on the northeast side of Main Street was lifted on stilts so that the front would line up to Main Street, but we can see the sudden drop-off down into the valley toward the Chinese district, which we'll explore in a moment. Not too far from this spot was the town's brewery and bottling works. Moving down what little remains of Main Street, we come to this wooden shack. It's definitely old, but doesn't correspond with anything on the map of the town. It's too small to be one of the businesses that line the street, but it may have been the bunkhouse that stood behind the lodging at 221 Main Street. If that's the case, then somehow this was moved a dozen or so feet closer to the road after the town had been destroyed. This is a very 80s nightstand right here, and that's plywood floor. So at some point, probably in the 80s, someone came along and tried to fix this place up. Nothing remains except the stone foundation and root cellar of the next site of interest. This was the old Moore House Hotel and Restaurant, with a barbershop on the first floor. This building was the first business built in town, as well as the first 3-story building, and by 1890 was under the lease of a Hugh Cumming. This finely appointed hotel is said to have been decorated in black walnut with tabletops of Tennessee marble. The next ruin on Main Street, and the last, was the town bank.
Behind me once stood the Hyde and Freylag Bank. It was the only bank in the town of Granite, and all that remains, as you can see, is just the stone vault. Actually, aside from the vault, this wood might be all that remains of the bank. Let's take a quick peek inside there. Oh, it is several degrees cooler in here. A reinforced ceiling.
Main Street was said to have been open 24 hours a day, with most shops open straight through the night to accommodate the miners who worked double shifts during the day. I can imagine walking down this street in the warm summer nights, just past 1 a.m., hearing the steam whistle in the distance from the mill above, and hearing the saloon music muffled inside the buildings and patrons dancing and playing by lamplight. Granite didn't seem to sleep, earning it the nickname the City Without Night. Continuing down Main Street, passing where several hotels once stood, we come to another street. Completely lost in the woods today and overgrown, Church Lane once cut between Main Street and Magnolia, with the Catholic church at the bottom of the hill. The church was popular among the Irish residents and was made of wood with a stone foundation. The stone foundation is still lingering today along the side of the road. Behind the Catholic church in this picture, we see the Methodist church, which sat on the slope and had this lower area beneath it, likely a meeting hall. Across the street, a little ways up the hill, was the largest church in town, the Episcopal Church. The pews from this church are actually still in use in the Episcopal Church of Philipsburg today. Finally, farther up the hill and on the other side of Magnolia was the Presbyterian Church. Some of the many town's residents were immigrants from Europe and Asia, which led to distinct neighborhoods popping up around the town of Granite. To the northwest of Main Street was Donegal Row, the Irish part of town. Cornish Row stretched down Broadway for the residents from England. In Granite, the English men and women were nicknamed Cousin Jacks and Cousin Jennies. Other neighborhoods were popular residents of immigrants from Finland or Sweden. And nestled in the valley between Bell Avenue and Main Street was the Chinese neighborhood. This area had several log cabins as well as their own laundry and saloon. While the site is protected now, before that, there were several beautiful pieces of pottery dug up in the Chinese part of town, including this one. This bottle likely contained alcohol and seems to have the Chinese character for Chinese on the bottom of it. Magnolia Avenue was home to the richer part of town, nicknamed Silk Stocking Row, or for the more critical, Snob Hill. This was where company officers and their families lived. This entire street was purely residential, so even though they had their own part of town, these folks were more than happy to head downtown and shop and dine with the rest of the workers. The Granite Miners Coronet Band taking a group photograph on Silk Stocking Row. Behind them, a two-story stone building. This stone building was built around 1889 and is the best preserved building on the entire Granite town site today. It was once the home to the superintendent of the Granite Mountain Mine, a man named Thomas Weir, along with his wife.
There's some new lumber on it. They've been working on maintaining this building, you can see.
They lived on the first floor. The second floor was his mining office.
That window over there is actually a doorway, and it goes to the mining office. The mining office was actually on the second floor of the superintendent's building. There's no stairwell connecting the first to the second floor. The first floor was the superintendent's house, and for security reasons, he had no access unless he came outside and went upstairs to the mining office. And that was so everybody could see what he was doing and when he was going in there. This doorway was accessed by a wooden bridge that came across here and connected to that doorway. And then up from the superintendent's house, another ruin. It's just building after building on this street.
This, like every other building along Magnolia, was home to a prominent member of granite society. Now just down the hill from Magnolia, we come to a neighborhood known as Sunnyside, presumably because it got the most sun. Aside from the dance hall and skating rink, the most notable structure here was the hospital, operated by the Granite Mining Company. Injury and illness were somewhat common in Granite. The mine averaged 3 deaths a year, but one of the darkest periods in the town's history came early on in 1884.
This was the site of the Granite Hospital.
Diphtheria plagued the newly established town, with the 8,000-foot altitude of granite complicating the treatments. Dozens of people were lost, including 35 children. In fact, the town's very first family to move in, the Hickey family, lost 3 of their 4 children.
Wow, you can actually see the remains of a hallway going that way. Just the wooden frame and the interior wall.
Granite had no cemetery at any point during its lifespan. Instead, bodies were always carried down to Philipsburg for burial. Just down the road from the hospital was the mining company's barns for work animals and supplies, with a wagon shed across the street. Until only a few years ago, this barn was partially standing. Now it's simply a pile of wood, and one of the last things that you see of Granite as you're driving away. The town's schoolhouse was located near the end of Broadway, to the north of the mill. The school was described as having good teachers, some of whom were educated in that very schoolhouse, and usually had between 50 and 100 students. 1891 saw one of the worst winters on record in that area, with a blizzard piling snow several feet deep. Sometime after that storm, this picture was taken, where we can see a snowman that was built by the town's barber, a barber nicknamed Wild Bill, and judging by the look of that snowman, you can tell just how wild that Bill was. Snow was great for people in Granite. In fact, they even had a long-standing bobsled track that stretched the full 4 miles from Granite down to Philipsburg. I'd love to know if this run was still possible today, but we visited during the summer. 1892 and the start of 1893 were lucrative times, but something happened in 1893 that you've heard me mention in all of my silver mining ghost town videos. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act was repealed. You see, up until now, the US government was required to buy a large amount of silver each month, which propped up the value of silver. But with its repeal in 1893, the price of silver plummeted, because there was not as much of a demand for it. Granite held on for a few more months, but finally in August, the mine's steam whistle was blown one last time, and the town was abandoned. And I mean abandoned. Within 24 hours, nearly all 3,000 residents of the town packed up and marched down that mountain, leaving Granite a complete ghost town. Mining did continue here, I guess with camps or using temporary structures, and a small population returned 3 years later. By 1898, the Granite Mountain and the bimetallic mining companies had made almost $30 million, or over $1 billion today, and was the largest silver mining operation in the world. So obviously an operation like that doesn't simply get abandoned and forgotten, and the town population returned somewhat. For a little bit, at least. This photograph was taken in 1901, 8 years after its initial abandonment, showing quite a number of people having returned for everyday life in the town. In 1908, this postcard was sent from Granite, showing the millworks on top of the hill. This rather cheeky postcard talks about how the sender and his fiancée have finally decided when they were going to get married, and the answer was never, and they asked if the recipient of the card would like to attend. Which I guess is considered funny by 1908 standards. Mining continued in Granite even into the 1950s, but in 1958, a massive fire broke out in the mine while they were surveying it. Nobody was killed, but the mine and nearly all of the major wooden structures around the mine and higher part of the town were burned to the ground. For the final few decades of Granite's existence, it had just 2 residents, and eventually 1. It was a couple originally from Philipsburg, John and May Werning, but May became a widow, and this became her full-time residence.
This was the home of the last resident of Granite, a woman named May, and she lived here by herself until her death at the age of 75 in 1969. In her later years, she actually served as watchkeeper of the town of Granite, make sure no one was coming up here and vandalizing things or getting into any other sorts of trouble. She lived in this quaint little house all by herself up on the mountainside. Looks like it was originally a single-room log cabin with additions towards the back and to the side here. It's got some very interesting architectural elements to it. This partial chimney and multiple closets in each corner. I'd love to know what people think of this. It's chimney-like, but it's propped up by wood.
This house, although on the verge of collapse, is the best preserved wooden dwelling in the town of Granite. In the back was a fairly lengthy closet that felt almost like a small hallway, leading back into the sloping earth behind the house.
Nothing too exciting in here, except that Capri Sun. What is it? Coastal cooler. All right. That sounds artificial as heck.
Not too far from May's house is this Masonic stone, isolated in the woods. Many of the town's founders and developers were Freemasons, and this block was likely erected as an indication of the town's dedication to the order. All around May's house are the scattered remnants of Donegal Row, the Irish part of town.
Walking around Granite, there's plenty of places where there once was a small structure that has been completely removed, but stone pilings and small bits of debris are all that remain.
The bimetallic mine was located only down the street from Main Street and was technically within the town limits of Granite. We can overlook the mine site now, and I hear there's still occasional activity down there. Earlier we saw the stone home that belonged to the foreman of the Granite Mountain Mining Company. Well, now we're looking at the ruins of the home belonging to the foreman of the Bimetallic Mining Company. Even today, with the house in the sorry state that it's in, you still can't beat that view. The east wall is collapsed, propped up only by a few timbers wedged in place.
I don't necessarily feel good walking under here.
For several years, the occupant of this home, the foreman of the Bimetallic, was a Mr. Wiegenstein.
Okay. Probably not going to walk any further into this room.
As you can see, the building is just about ready to come down completely. There was plenty to explore inside and learn from this place, but I only went in rooms that I didn't think were about to fall on top of me. Still, when exploring a site like this, always be cautious.
So as I'm walking, I'm doing my best not to put any weight on the structure. I'm trying to step very cautiously.
This house likely dates all the way back to the establishment of the bimetallic mine and mill, back around 1888. With so much activity on the site since, the building was modified extensively over the years.
Not much else to say about this house, other than it must have been beautiful when it was lived in.
As long as the weather isn't bad, the road up the mountain to Granite from Philipsburg is an easy drive for virtually any car or truck, but don't bring a camper up here. There's stories of people racing their cars down this road in the 1920s and 30s. I strongly advise against you doing that, or else you'll end up like these cars in a gully on the side of that road.
It's just a pile of old cars. At least 3 of them, maybe more down the hill. There are info boards up here so that when you come and you see a site, you can actually read a little bit about that specific building or site's history. Unfortunately, a lot of them look like this.
If you want to take the time to visit Granite, you may want to consider staying overnight in Philipsburg. When we first got to Philipsburg, we thought we'd entered the Twilight Zone. We were driving in the middle of nowhere for an hour, driving through mountains and valleys, and then suddenly we just hit this beautiful, old-fashioned American small town full of life and bustling. Homemade ice cream, breweries, museums, and plenty of places to stay.
The money from the granite mines was used to build up Philipsburg as a really pretty town, and it has since been fixed up, repainted, and it's a really nice place to visit.
Visiting Granite was suggested to me by my friend Alan Patera, who runs an excellent magazine called Western Places. He hasn't done anything on Granite yet, but maybe this video will help convince him. Thanks to his suggestion, we got to visit this incredible location and learn about this interesting little lost town. A special thank you to my supporters on Patreon, especially Marlo Perez, Kelly Black, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Kaiser Friedrich III, Zach Richards, Donald Anderson, Cody Henricks, Joan Haynes, Sean Kimball, Glenn Biddiscombe, Stephen Schwankert, Gabriel Colomb, RGB, Tara Mollikar, Keith Holland, Miles Garrett, Jennifer, Rob M., Amos Mayhew, Corey Andrews, Nicholas Masella, Cole Tanik, Sophie Baber, Rob, Oliver Chin Chen, John Maluski, David Watipka, Tiffany Raridan, Mad Time Media, Nathan Gutierrez, Max Metcalf, David Littlejohn, Sean Sahi Fraser, Nikki Chan 92, Corbin McDonald, Matthew Burns, Goblin of the Salt Plains, Luke Stevens, Gordon Robbins, Aaron Stark, Troy Wentworth, Clarkey, Sam Forker, and Busy Bee.